Well, good evening and Happy New Year. It feels really strange to be back here after after finishing our lecture series last year in November. So it's really wonderful to see you all again. So welcome. So welcome to the first of our 2014 series. We were pretty excited about what we were able to pull together last year for this lecture series, but this year we feel somehow we've been able to pull together the cream of the crop internationally, and you might think that's an exaggeration, but if you have a look at the people that we've been able to catch on their way through Australia and convince them to come west to speak to us here, then you'll agree with us that this year we've got some very, very interesting presenters coming our way, and tonight's a great way to kick off. So before we start, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land on which we meet and pay my respect to their elders past and present, and also to elders in this room. So just in terms of this lecture series, can you imagine if we could bring someone to this lecture series who had been classified last year as one of the 5 leaders of tomorrow? That would be pretty good, wouldn't it, for Western Australia to get someone of that calibre here? And what about if we could also bring somebody who in 2010 had won a Book of the Year award from the American Journal of Nursing? Or if we could have someone who in 2011 won the National Mature Media Awards for a book and was also listed in one of the must-have titles in a collection of must-read books. Well, Al Power is actually all of those people. He's won all of those accolades, and we feel really thrilled, Al, to have you here with us tonight. If we want to get a little bit more official, and I'll read a little from his biography, Al is a doctor of medicine, is a board-certified internist and geriatrician. He's clinical associate professor of medicine at the University of Rochester in New York, and a fellow of the American College of Physicians and the American Society for Internal Medicine. Dr. Power is a certified Eden Alternative educator, a member of the Eden Alternative Board of Directors, and an international educator on transformational models of care for older adults, particularly those living with changing cognitive abilities. Alzheimer's has had a long association with Al, and we spent some time with him with our staff yesterday, and I know that he's been busy around Perth today, and we're really excited to be able to start this 2014 lecture series with someone of Al's calibre and of his passion and commitment, but also of someone who's absolutely determined to find new and better ways to respond, and to make sure that in 5 years' time and 10 years' time we look back and say, did we really do it like that back then? And to actually be a real driver of change. So everybody, I'd like you to welcome to the podium Dr. Al Power. Let's give him a Perth welcome.
Thank you, everybody, and thanks so much, Rhonda, for that lovely introduction. If this lecture series is attracting a wide variety of international speakers, I think part of the reason is because AAWA is doing some really remarkable things here. And having spoken around the world for various organizations, I can tell you that you really have a special group here in Perth. And so since there are so many people new to the lecture series, I just wanted to take a moment to say that, because there really are some great things going on. And check the literature, talk to the folks here about what AAWA has to offer. And I don't want to be a spoiler, but there are some new community projects coming down the road that are going to be exciting too. So hopefully we'll be hearing more about those in the next several weeks to months. So thank you for having me here. I'm going to give a talk about living positively with dementia. That may already sound a little bit strange to some people in the room, and it may get stranger as the evening goes on. This is probably not your typical talk. It's definitely not your typical doctor talk. And as Rhonda said, my career has been as a practicing physician, first in internal medicine in private practice as a GP, but then for over 20 years working in residential care homes. And most recently just touring and educating full-time and not doing the day-to-day practice. But this came really from my own frustration with the way we care for people who live with different forms of dementia and trying to find some new ideas. So I don't have any special research expertise. I'm not a neurologist or a psychiatrist. I'm just someone who's trying to find a better way. And I'd like to share some of those ideas with you this evening. And we will leave plenty of time at the end for discussion because usually my talk generates a lot of questions and comments. And so hopefully we'll give you that too. I'm going to start by using a couple of opening statements to frame the talk that may or may not seem contradictory or confusing, but I just want to explore these because there's so much language and media attention being given to this family of conditions. And so I want to give you a little perspective just to start, which you may be a little different from what you've heard. The first one is, oh, and by the way, this is a picture of Birkeland Nursing Home in southern Denmark, a woman who sometimes during the day gets a little bit frazzled and needs to take a rest, but at that point doesn't feel safe going to her room and lying down. And here's one of her carers who actually lies down and helps her take a nap during the day too. Oh, there we go. Okay, so this looks contradictory. The number of people living with Alzheimer's and other forms of dementia is rising rapidly, but each successive generation's risk of getting dementia is not. So what does that mean? Well, there are some recent studies that suggest that with each succeeding decade of people, each succeeding generation that comes through, your lifetime risk of developing Alzheimer's and other forms of dementia is probably not increasing and may actually be decreasing. At least some of that may be due to advances in cardiovascular health and other forms of health. And yet the numbers are going up and up and up. There are probably about 35 or more million people in the world living with Alzheimer's, and there could be a triple, 115 million perhaps, by the year 2050. So why is that? Well, that's because of people like me who belong to a generation called the baby boomers. So what's happening is even though my risk of getting Alzheimer's may not be as high as the people that came in the generation before me, there's just a lot more people like me. And when this bubble starts to hit the older age group, and we are currently turning 65 at the rate of 10,000 Americans per day, and you can extrapolate that to Australia and other countries, you will see this big bubble of older people. And within that bubble of older people, you will see an increasing number of people who live with different symptoms of cognitive change. And so once again, just to put some perspective in that, yes, the numbers are increasing. Yes, it's a concern, but it doesn't mean that everybody in this audience is going to get Alzheimer's or dementia because those numbers, we are making improvements in health and we are seeing some changes there too. Now the second one, which may look a little contradictory, is that I'm still not sure what I'll work on this. I'll tell you what I'm going to do. There we go. A bad news, good news thing. Really, when you look at available drugs on the market worldwide, there has not been a major advance in available medications for Alzheimer's really in 20 years. A couple new brands have come out, but they all work on the same chemical pathways. They all have about the same level of efficacy as far as symptomatic control. And there's nothing on the market that stops or reverses the course of dementia. The good news, though, is that I believe that all of you can do more to improve the lives of people living with dementia than any pill that's on the market, and probably more than any pill which will come available in the foreseeable future. And I'm going to explain why I say that throughout this talk. This is not about something new I invented. This is about me trying to look at a very old illness with new eyes. And so I use this quote by Marcel Proust: "The only true voyage of discovery would be not to visit strange lands, but to possess other eyes, to behold the universe through the eyes of another, of 100 others, to behold the 100 universes that each of them beholds, that each of them is." That's really what all this is about. And so I'm just going to tell you a little bit about what's happening in the U.S., what got me started down this road. And when I talk about Dementia Beyond Drugs, the name of my first book, the thing I was really focusing on was those antipsychotic drugs that we often use to respond to distress or other types of expressions that people with dementia have. In the U.S., the number of antipsychotics over the first decade of this century, as you can see, the sales went up over double. The prescriptions went up, and once again, there are many reasons to use these drugs, But for every person with schizophrenia, the illness for which these drugs were developed, there are probably about 25 antipsychotic prescriptions being written. And there's only one population that's increasing faster than the population of our country, and that is the population of older people, and particularly people living with dementia. And as you can see, when you look at residential care-based pharmacies, nearly 30% of those prescriptions were dispensed by those pharmacies. So we know where a lot of these drugs are going. An interesting fact is that Medicaid, our public assistance for people who are poor or chronically disabled, spends more money on antipsychotic drugs than they do on heart disease or antibiotics. So that's a huge expenditure. And as you can see, currently in the US, about 23% of all people in nursing homes with and without dementia are getting an antipsychotic drug on a particular day. And if you take people with a diagnosis of dementia, that is greater than a third. And that number is replicated, as we will see elsewhere. So I'm going to share some big secrets with you. These aren't really secrets, but they're things that we don't talk about, and I love to talk about things that you don't hear much about. And first of all, it's certainly not an American or an Australian problem. If you look around the world, you see very similar numbers over the past decade for use in care homes. And once again, worldwide, if you live in a care home and if you have a diagnosis of dementia that is reportable on your chart, then it's really closer to, right now, probably about a third of people. It was close to 40% several years ago, but there has been some headway in reducing these medications. So I can't tell you the exact number today, but it's about a third of people with dementia at any given time. Now, as a doctor, what I'd like to know, if I'm going to use these medications, is are they effective and are they safe? And I didn't feel they were particularly effective, and so I started challenging this. And the first thing I did was I pulled all the studies that I could find over the past 50 years that purported to show a benefit of antipsychotic drugs. And I did something that, as a busy practicing doctor, I never did. I actually read them with a fine-tooth comb and with a critical eye. And, you know, we're too busy. We just look at the summaries of the journals, and we go back to work, go to our conferences. People tell us to use these drugs, and we use these drugs. What I found, interestingly, was every single study that I could find that's ever been published showing a benefit was sponsored by the company making the pill that was being tested. Now, that may not shock you, and it doesn't mean that the studies are automatically invalid, but when you have that kind of sponsorship, you have to wonder about potential biases in this study. Whom do you include? Whom do you exclude? What endpoints do you measure? I noticed that some of these studies didn't make their primary endpoints, so they did secondary data analysis and found little things that they thought were significant and went back and reported that. How you word your studies, and even what do you send for publication? If your company sponsors a study that doesn't show very good results, you're not going to send that off to the major medical journals to broadcast how poorly your drug did. And we know from published studies that the studies that make it to publication usually are the most positive ones. The negative ones, the indeterminate ones, often never see the light of day. There also, when I looked at these carefully, are many flaws in the studies. There are many things I found looking with a critical eye that I'd never noticed before. The interesting thing, though, is if you take the best studies, you ignore the flaws and the biases, take them at face value, those studies show at best about a 17 or 18% improvement over placebo. We have this idea that, well, they work for a lot of people, but not everybody. But the truth is they don't work for most people. And when you look at the flaws and the biases in the studies and realize what hasn't been published, you realize that even 18% is probably an inflated number. So not a lot of efficacy here. On the other side is the risk. And those of us who've been around long enough to remember the old antipsychotics, the first generation, like Thorazine, Haldol, Mellaril, we know about these things on top of the list, that they can cause sedation, lethargy, falls, movement disorders, constipation, weight loss, decreased appetite. The newer drugs came out about 20 years ago, and they were purported to be safer, but equally effective. And the truth is, when you look at the things at the top of that list, they do cause less of that than the old drugs. They're not zero. They do cause those things, but you're less likely to get rigidity or movement disorders on a newer drug than an old drug. But now that we've had them for 15 to 20 years, we've seen a bunch of new side effects that we were not aware of before. We see weight gain. We see elevated blood sugars. We see elevated risks of stroke and pneumonia. And now there have been a number of studies which show an independent increased risk of death compared to placebo. 18 studies I'm aware of. Clive Ballard's from England showed a double risk over 3 years of mortality attributable only to being on the drug. So often when there are doctors in the audience, I ask them, if you have a patient with pneumonia and you had an antibiotic to use that worked maybe 18% of the time and could raise the death rate by 60 or 70%, who would ever give it to a patient? Well, we never would. So why do we do this? Well, we're not stupid. We do this because we see people who have very real distress. their family members, their professional carers are distressed, and we are called upon to do something, and we don't have anything better. So maybe the answer is not a better pill. That's what I'm suggesting. And we're going to go into just how we get stuck in this view that people need medication and how we can help get out of it. That leads us to our big secret number 2, which is that this is just not a problem with residential care. We get all the attention in residential care because we're able to track this through our auditors, through our regulatory mechanisms. These drugs are not approved by most countries for use in dementia. They're just used, as we say, off-label. And so there's no way to measure how many people in their own homes are actually taking these drugs. There are no good studies of this. There are only a couple I could find. They're not very diverse. And I did my own audit of people coming into our large care home where I've worked up until recently in Rochester. But if you extrapolate the little bit of data we have, it's quite likely that the absolute number of people taking these drugs is much higher in the community than it is in care homes. So this is not a residential care problem. This is a problem that represents societal views and approaches to dementia. So it goes well beyond those people who live in residential care. So I'm going to stop there and ask you a question, a very simple question, which is, what is dementia? And asking this question, I'm not looking for any fancy definitions. I got lots of people here who can tell us all about what the scientists say about dementia. What I would like to hear from you for a moment is just when you hear the words dementia or Alzheimer's, what are some of the words or phrases that pop into your head? There really are no wrong answers. Does someone like to have one that they'd like to share with me? Yell it out.
Life-changing.
Life-changing. Thank you. Anything else? Confusion. Very good. More? Loss of self. Repetition. Repetition. No, I'm just kidding. Yes, go ahead. I'm sorry. Do they still know who you are? Often it seems that's not the case. Often that is not the case. Okay? Fear. Isolation. Agitation. A couple more. Frustration, memory loss. I'm sorry? Victim. Loneliness and helplessness. Okay, great. Pretty good list. You all heard that. I repeated it so you could hear what people were saying. 2 things about that list. Everything that you said is true. Those things all happen. We see them every day. Those of us who have worked and lived with people living with dementia have seen these things. The second thing about this list is this is not a list that is generated only in Perth, Australia. I've asked that same question of audiences all over the world, and I get fairly similar lists to what you just gave me. Is there anything else about that list anybody else noticed? All negative. A few people yelled that out. It's all negative. Okay. The purpose of my talk is not to pretend that it's easy to live with dementia or it's easy to support somebody who lives with dementia, but to suggest that our paradigm is to jump to the losses, to the deficits, to the tragedy and the burdens of the illness. Not to pretend it's not there, but I'm going to try to convince you that a narrow deficit-based view may actually affect our systems of care for people, our approach to people, and even affect their well-being and their capabilities. And so this is where I started. When I became disenchanted with the use of medications, when I was looking for a better way, I went back and looked at what was it that got us into using all these drugs that don't work very well and are particularly harmful. What is it that leads us down this road? And so examining just what we did here, I looked at what I call the biomedical model of dementia. And this is our dominant model of dementia for the past several decades. There have been switches, societal-wise, is how we see dementia over the years. But for the last, certainly since I began my medical training, we have seen dementia as a family, a constellation of degenerative diseases of the brain. We see it as loss of nerve cells, loss of functional abilities, loss of cognitive abilities. We see it mainly from the standpoint of deficits and what people can no longer do. We see it as progressive, incurable, ultimately fatal for many people. And we tend to focus on the burdens of care, burdens for individuals, burdens for families, burdens for our care systems. And we tend to put a large amount of our charitable funds, certainly in the US we do, into drug research because we want to try to find ways to reverse this or to stop the process. Now, just like the list we generated, there's nothing I just told you that is wrong inherently or that I'm saying does not happen. But this is where we heavily focus. From the bedside to national policy discussions, This is where we put all of our efforts and all of our conversation. And when you have a narrow focus that does not, the more we look at plaques and tangles and tau proteins in the brain, sometimes the less we see the person who's experiencing those plaques and tangles. And when you have that narrow deficit-based focus, there is fallout for the individuals who live with dementia and those who support them. And here's a few examples of some of the biomedical fallout. One of the first things is when we try to help people create well-being, we look almost exclusively to drug therapy. And that's why doctors get stuck and say, we know these drugs aren't great, but we don't have anything better. As if the only thing we can do is come up with a better pill when someone is distressed. Another big problem is our researchers tend to ignore the subjective experience of people living with dementia. After all, we're trying to be evidence-based, and they're confused. We can't trust what they say, and so we have to ignore that. I think this is a big mistake, as I'm going to explain to you very soon. I was just reading an article a friend sent me recently that came from Montreal in Quebec, Canada, and they were looking at people who call out in care homes and trying to see, is this actually an expression of ability to exercise choice for people that can't communicate in other ways? And they had a series of interviews with elders, with families, with professional carers. And in the article, they reported the results of the interviews with the families and the professional carers. And their reasoning was that Quebec has provincial regulation which prohibits researchers from reporting on anything that's reported to them from people living with dementia. So once again, we actually have a regulation in this province that is discounting the words of people living with dementia right from the outset. Pretty powerful stuff. We are very quick to stigmatize people, to label them. And once again, you hear these common media phrases like dementia is the long goodbye, people are fading away, even more extreme like it's a living death, or people are an empty shell, the person's no longer there. And we don't do this because we're bad people. We do this because we're trying to increase public awareness and educate. And we're trying to talk about the seriousness of this condition. But if you think about it, when we use such phrases that actually diminish the person, we're actually taking the humanity away from the very people we're trying to help. And there's a big problem with believing that the person is no longer there or that they're fading away. And that is, if you don't believe there's a person there anymore, what happens to your ethical obligation to provide humanized care to that person? It often goes away. And we see this every day. We don't see this in frank abuse in most environments, but we see it in all living environments, in those little day-to-day interactions and things we do that diminish the worth of the person. And we'll talk about that some more. We tend to create institutionalized approaches to care, disease-based approaches to care, and we tend to blame the stress on the disease. He is striking out because he has dementia. She is wandering because she has dementia, instead of looking for something further. How bad is that stigma? I want to tell you a story. And once again, the purpose of the story is not to blame people or point fingers, but to talk about how deep these stigmas erode our societal views of dementia. This is my friend Ed Voris, who I was able to meet not too long ago. I have two good friends from San Francisco, Dr. Nader Shabahangi and Dr. Patrick Fox. They know Ed, and they wrote a book with Ed called Conversations with Ed, where they just have a series of conversations about his experience of living with Alzheimer's. Ed is a pretty remarkable person. He's had a very positive life, and he continues to live positively in spite of living with Alzheimer's, in spite of having more changes in his ability as the years go on. But interestingly, Ed tells a story in the book about his diagnosis, which I think is very eye-opening. When Ed began to have some changes, it was not something that other people around him would have noticed. But Ed, being very intelligent, very articulate, was able to tell himself that he was having trouble. So he would have more trouble finding words and phrases than he used to. He would know the rhythm of what he wanted to say, but he couldn't get those words out. He'd lose his car in the parking lot. I'm sure that's never happened to anybody here. But the truth is that even though we've all been through that, he could look at going back to his mental map and drawing blanks and realize there's something wrong here. I'm having more trouble doing things than I used to. So he took himself to his physician. He told the doctor what he was having trouble doing and asked the doctor for testing for Alzheimer's. He went through the x-rays, the cognitive tests, the blood tests, the whole battery, and it turned out he did have what looked like early onset, or not early onset, but early symptoms of Alzheimer's disease. Unfortunately, the way he found out from his doctor was he got a letter in the mail 3 weeks later with dementia on top and 3 pages of information. So Ed had two problems. His first problem was he had to find a new doctor, and the second one was he had to get some help. So as you can imagine, that was very distraught. Here's this very disturbing diagnosis. He was worried about it. Now it's been confirmed. He's got to get some help. So he drove himself to a local dementia support chapter in his town in California. He walked in, introduced himself to the person at the desk, said, "My name is Ed Voris. I've just been diagnosed with early stage Alzheimer's, and I've come here for some resources and some support." And the person at the desk said to him, "Where's your family member? Where's your advocate?" And he said, "Well, I'm here advocating for myself." And the person said, "I can't talk to you. Come back when you're with a family member." So yeah, I know, shocking. And that's not just one place. He went to 2 or 3 other adult support organizations in his community, got the same answer from everyone. So once again, these aren't bad people, but we have such a strong paradigm that they saw him because he said the words, "I have Alzheimer's," as somebody who couldn't make an appointment, take home a brochure, process information. The truth is, he was doing so well at that point that if he had walked in the door and said, "My wife has Alzheimer's," they would have given him everything he needed because there was nothing else to suggest that he would have any trouble setting that up. So, and once again, these are not bad people, but this is the way we're taught to look at dementia, and these are the people who are actually most knowledgeable. Imagine what the average person on the street thinks about Alzheimer's. I can tell you, my good friend Richard Taylor, who lives with Alzheimer's, and I do a lot of speaking together, and we went to Atlanta, Georgia to speak for a large coalition there, and we went out to dinner at a favorite Southern cooking restaurant. And the hostess was a very charming lady who brought us to our seats, and Richard was dressed in his coat and tie like he always likes to dress. And she asked us, she could tell we weren't from around there, we didn't talk like they do in Georgia, and she asked us what we were doing, and we told them what we were there for, and Richard explained that he was living with the symptoms of Alzheimer's and had been for over a decade. And the woman almost fainted. She couldn't believe that a person with Alzheimer's could come to a restaurant, eat dinner, speak coherently. That was her view of Alzheimer's, was that people were completely unable to communicate as soon as they had that label. So it shows where the education lack is in our community and how powerful the stigmas are. Another example of how powerful stigma is a study that just came out of San Diego, California, a few weeks ago, that looked at people. You know, most people with Alzheimer's do not have strong genetic markers for it, but a small number of people, maybe 1 or 2% of all the people with Alzheimer's, have a strong gene marker that highly raises their risk and the risk of their family members of getting Alzheimer's. And they took a bunch of people who they had studied, who they'd done blood tests to look for this gene marker. And they took people who had a positive gene, who did not have dementia at that time, but their lifetime risk was greatly increased because they were carrying this gene. And they told half of the people they had the gene, and the other half they didn't. And they put them through cognitive testing. And the people who were told they had the gene scored significantly worse on cognitive tests, even though there was no reason to believe they would be worse than the other half. And they also, their self-rated view of their memory was much lower than the other half. So just knowing that you have a risk actually made people perform worse. So it's a real self-fulfilling prophecy when the stigma is that powerful. They actually didn't do as well on brain tests just by knowing that they had a risk someday for getting dementia. Interestingly, they took the other group who tested negative, and they told half that group that they tested negative, and they were clear, and they didn't tell the other half. And even though those two groups performed the same, the people that didn't know they were clear actually had lower self-reported ratings of their memory than the people who were told they were in the clear. So very, very powerful messages come with these things. We can't not take dementia seriously, but we have to understand what our discourse and our conversations do to the lives of people. And I think this is behind some of the resistance to early detection. Because when we see such stigma in society, if we're going to be treated like less of a person, who's going to rush out and find out they have that label? You know, and so many people say to me, "I wouldn't want to know." And I think a lot of it is because of that fear that society's going to treat me differently once I have that label. So why do we do this? Well, nobody in the story was a bad person. We're not lazy, stupid, or uncaring. Doctors, nurses, doesn't matter who we are. But we do have a paradigm for viewing dementia. And I realized that this was a powerful thing, that if I was going to come up with new answers, I had to change this. So how do I do that? Well, as Dr. Deepak Chopra says, instead of thinking outside the box, maybe we just need to get rid of the box completely. And so I said, I've got to go right back to the beginning. But I didn't quite know how to do that. And it was around this time, maybe 7 years ago, when I was struggling with this, trying to explain to my colleagues why I was, quote, under-medicating people with dementia when they all thought I should be using more drugs, that I started listening to another group of people. And as a doctor for over a quarter century, I'm embarrassed to admit that this was a group I hadn't paid enough attention to in my career. They're not neurologists, they're not psychiatrists, they're not geriatricians, they're not psychologists, but in my mind, they are the true experts on dementia. And those are actually the people who live with dementia and tell us what it's like. So I decided the first step really is to change our minds about people whose minds have changed and to understand that they have an experience that we have to appreciate if we're going to get anywhere. We can't discount that as being confused. We have to listen to people and understand that, because none of us will ever know exactly what it's like to live with Alzheimer's unless we experience it ourselves. And my good friend Richard Taylor up there with a white beard can be a bit confrontational sometimes, but I understand Richard, because Richard has lived with this. He's lived with the stigma. And so he has to advocate for himself, because often people will discount him if he doesn't speak up. And so when Richard's invited to speak for a group like this, sometimes he will say, "Thank you for inviting me to speak. All of you out there learned about dementia from somebody who didn't have dementia, and they in turn learned about dementia from someone who didn't have dementia. So it's so great that you finally got someone with dementia to come here and teach you what it's really like." And that's Richard, but I love hearing him say things like that, because when I first met Richard and started reading his blog, reading his book, he challenged me. I wasn't sure I agreed with everything he said, but he made me realize that there was a voice there that I had to pay attention to, because I didn't really know. Christine Bryden, your own Christine Bryden from Australia, worked for the Prime Minister's office, was diagnosed at age 46, which came from her getting lost driving home from work one day back in 1995. Now going on 19 years living with Alzheimer's, still advocating, still speaking out, still writing. Christine was quoted much in my first book from her book, Dancing with Dementia, an incredible book. And I actually had an interview with Christine. She was kind enough to write me about some of her experiences for a section of my new book. Interestingly, because Christine Bryden, I remember from her book, she and her husband Paul are both on their second marriage. She was diagnosed in 1995, and she met Paul and married him a few years later. And Paul has been a real source of help for her in traveling around the world, starting support networks, speaking out, standing up for people's rights living with dementia. But I thought about that, because I have a chapter on connectedness, as you'll find out. And I thought, well, one topic that connects to connectedness is intimacy and sexuality. And I thought, this is interesting. Christine Bryden actually met and fell in love with Paul 3 years after her diagnosis. So I wrote her and I said, "I'd love to interview you for my book. How did it go when you announced to your family and friends 3 years into your diagnosis that you'd fallen in love and were going to get married?" And it was a very interesting story, because it was not a clear-cut thing. She had some barriers. People questioned her judgment, questioned the motivations of each person in the couple. What's going on here? Is this safe? Can we trust them? And yet here she is 19 years later with a very strong, 18 years since marriage, 1999, actually 16 years since they got married, 15 years with a very, I'll work on my math here. 15 years this August. Now I remember what she told me. Boy, I thought I was good at math too. But here she is, 15 years on, with a very strong marriage. And we talk about choose your favorite politician, athlete, entertainer, and look at some of the relationships they've entered into. And when we talk about impaired judgment, who is it that has exercised better judgment? The person with dementia or some of the other people we can name? So we're very quick to stigmatize when sometimes we shouldn't do that. Ed Voris is up there. Jim Mann from Vancouver is another advocate. But even the people that cannot stand up like I am and speak to an audience of a couple hundred, even if they say things that don't make sense to us, I believe it's extremely important that we try to find ways to understand what they're saying. And I'm going to give you some clues about that later on in the talk, because their experience is a big part of how we understand this and how we care differently. And so I decided, armed with this knowledge and all this idea about stigma and the firm biomedical model, that the only way I could find new answers was to shake that model loose and to find a way to define dementia that would tell what's happening to the person in language that was as free of judgment and stigma as possible. So here's my definition. A little fuzzy. You might think it's a little too flaky for you, but I'm going to ask you to just indulge me for a few minutes. Dementia is a shift in the way a person experiences the world around her or him. That's all. I'm not experiencing the world around me the same way I did 5 years ago, 20 years ago. Now, I think you probably agree that at its most basic, that is true. You might say it's too vague or too general, or it doesn't only apply to dementia, and that's actually intentional. Certainly, if you were trying to find the next drug and you need to know what chemicals to mix together in the lab, this wouldn't help you. But for the rest of us, I'm not going to invent the next pill. For the rest of us who are not in the drug lab, who are just trying to support people living with dementia, this actually is a pretty handy definition, because it takes away those things that narrow our vision and blind us to new ideas. And the truth is that this has happened to everybody in this room. I'm guessing if you're 50, 60, 70 years old, you probably don't experience the world the way you did maybe when you were 20 or 25. Is that fair? And if you're 20 or 25, you probably don't experience the world quite the way you did when you were 8 or 10. So we know that as we go through the various experiences, changes of life, moves, jobs, education, new friends, new experiences, our perspective can change. And while it may not change as drastically as it does in a person living with Alzheimer's or other forms of dementia, we understand that it's possible to start seeing the world differently. And this is actually a definition that connects us, helps us look through other people's eyes and begin to understand or at least appreciate that they're seeing things differently. Most of our medical definitions tend to separate people. We put them in a box, or maybe 50 boxes, the Alzheimer's box, the Lewy body box, the frontotemporal box, and we say they have a disease, we don't understand them. That doesn't help us find new answers. This can help us find new answers. And when I started playing with this and listening to those voices, I started going down a very different road that I've been going down for the first couple decades of my career. And this is what had happened. One of the first things that happened when I finally met Richard in person, speaking at Alzheimer's Disease International 5 years ago in Singapore, one of the things he said in his keynote was, "I'm not dying of a fatal disease. I'm living with a chronic disability." That really struck me, because first of all, he changed the focus from dying to living. I'm still here. I haven't gone anywhere. I'm here in front of you. And the second thing was he changed it from fatal disease to chronic disability. Now, I'm not here to open up the can of worms of what Alzheimer's is it a disease, how much of it is part of aging. We can have that debate somewhere else. What I'm talking about is the disability mindset. It's a frame of mind that helps you see new things. When you see dementia as disability, or maybe to use the language, changing abilities or different abilities, then you start to see a whole new landscape. Because truthfully, what we've done most of the time with dementia, our goals as doctors have been to try to keep people living longer, to slow their decline. And that's okay, but that's not our goal with people with disabilities. We're not just trying to keep people from declining. We're trying to keep people with disabilities having much more meaningful lives, being educated, having meaningful work, volunteer opportunities, abilities to make choice and control over their lives. When you see dementia that way, it expands your horizons as to what people might achieve. And we start moving from what I call psychotropic medications to what I call ramps. Once again, this is using the disability metaphor. And I like to explain this by having you imagine somebody who has a different kind of change in ability, not dementia. Imagine a young person who plays for the local rugby club, who has a tragic injury to his spine, becomes paralyzed from the waist down, and can no longer walk. Permanent change, also a person whose experience of the world has changed drastically. He's now in a wheelchair, his legs don't move, and if he came to this talk and there were nothing but 10 steps outside, he'd be stuck because he couldn't come in and join the lecture. But, of course, we provide ramps and other types of access for people in wheelchairs because we want people that cannot walk to continue to succeed in a world of people that mostly do walk. And I realized when I started using this disability mindset that our problem is we're not building ramps for people with dementia. And in this case, I'm not talking about wheelchair ramps so much as I'm talking about cognitive ramps, brain ramps. What we tend to do is we take people whose brains and whose experience of the world is changing irreversibly, and we put them in living environments that are based on our view of the world, our schedules, our needs, our staffing patterns, and we expect them to fit, even though their brains are changing and their abilities are changing. And when they can't fit, if that's distressing, we put them on these very powerful sedating medications, and we blame their disease on their ability to cope, inability to cope. Think about the guy in the wheelchair. Imagine he's sitting outside 10 steps in his wheelchair, wondering what to do. Imagine Jason and I walking up to him and saying, well, I'll tell you what we think you should do. We all walk up the steps, so we think you should do that too. So we're going to pick you up, and you just go on in there and join us. And we lift him up by the armpits and let go, and what do you think is going to happen? He's going to fall right in his face, right? Because his legs don't work that way anymore. And if he's lying there on the steps cursing at us because we dropped him to the ground, it'd be pretty funny for me and Jason to look at each other and say, well, he's got a bit of a behavior problem, doesn't he? Why don't we give him some Seroquel and see if we can calm him down? Now, that seems pretty ridiculous, but I'm going to tell you right now, we do that every day in all living environments for people with dementia. We put them in places based on our needs, expect them to adapt to us, and when they can't, we medicate them. And that happens in care homes, and it happens in your own house. And this is what we have to shift. One of the things we have to do is understand that the person's subjective experience is critical, and that that person is still there, and they continue to learn and grow. One of the things that we kind of forget is that people form new memories all the time with dementia. Once again, we're taught to look at deficits. They're forgetting, they're losing memories, they're losing abilities. People with dementia learn new things all the time. It may take different approaches, it may take repetition, but it's happening every day. And I always ask care staff who are skeptical about that, who think a person with advanced dementia can't learn, to try an experiment. To take a gentleman in your home, get 4 or 5 staff members, take him to a shower at a time of day when he doesn't want it, force him to have that shower, and then about 3 days later get the same staff members and take him back to the shower room. See if he remembers anything about what happened the other day. People learn new things all the time. Sometimes it's more emotional memory than factual memory, but there is learning. There's even intuitive, subconscious, what we call intrinsic learning that goes on. Stephen Sabat talks about a gentleman with advanced dementia who often couldn't remember names or places or dates, but he went to the hospital because of an illness, and in the hospital he shuffled his feet, and whenever he went to the bathroom, there was a little ledge on the entrance to the bathroom, and he kept stumbling, and he had to learn subconsciously to lift his foot when he stepped into the bathroom so he wouldn't trip. And after several days in the hospital, he came back to his care home, and even though he had a level floor into his bathroom, he would pick up his foot every time he went into the bathroom. So there's all kinds of new learning, new connections going on, but we're not taught to see that. We're only taught to see those brain cells that have stopped working and to focus on those. It's a deficit-based approach which doesn't help us find new answers. We realize, as Jim Mann says, that he has a new normal. He's not going to be the person he was before, and you can't make him the person he was before. Just as surely as I can't run as fast as when I was on the college cross-country team. It means I have to change my goals for exercise, and people with dementia have to change their life goals as well. They're not gone, but they're a different person, and we have to accommodate what people do well and learn to work on those existing strengths. And it means that we have to look for what are those universal needs. What are the things that people still need, whether they can do this or not, whether they can remember this or not. What do we have to fulfill? And this led me to challenge many of our basic care practices, the way we respond to distress, many of our approaches to care. So in other words, when I started with this fuzzy, flaky definition, for me, everything changed completely. I saw things differently. Now, I think what I'm going to do, because I want to have, I had a little video clip. I'm not going to use that tonight because I want to have lots of time for discussion. So when you see that slide, I'm going to skip over it. But here's 3 different ways of looking at people, depending on your mindset. The first one I commonly hear from family members. Dad has totally lost it. He thinks I was his father instead of his son. He's gone beyond recognition. If we can't remember, we're no longer there. That's kind of the way we put the weight of memory on how we view people, how we view the completeness of people. But here's Richard Taylor in his book saying, if I call you mom or dad, I'm probably not confusing with mom or dad. I may very well know they're dead, but I connect the feelings I have with my mom or dad. I miss them. I need those feelings. And often when I talk to you, I interchange people, and it's just, I don't take the time to separate one from the other. Or Dr. Nader Shabahangi, who says, sometimes we use things like a wedding ring to symbolize something from the past. And sometimes a person like yourself in present time can symbolize a mother or father or somebody from the past. And he says sometimes when old people combine one thought with another, that's often poetic. Now, saying that's poetic is a long way from saying that's delusional, isn't it? So there's a lot of ways to look at what people say. So one more way to look at this shift, and then we'll talk about where I think we should be going. Cough syrup does not cure pneumonia. Big surprise, right? You all knew that. The biggest problem even person-centered care advocates have is they still see people's distress as the problem rather than a symptom of something larger. So I constantly hear, please help me. He has a problem with striking out. He has a problem with calling out. He has a problem with wandering. But you know, people with pneumonia often cough. But the cough is only a symptom. It's not the real problem. If Rhonda had pneumonia and I were her doctor and I came and examined her and all I saw was the cough, I would say to her, Rhonda, I've diagnosed your problem. You have a bad cough. Here's some cough syrup. That should take care of you. And I might quiet the cough for a while, but what's going on with that pneumonia? It's still there. It's still festering. And eventually Rhonda's going to get worse because I didn't see the real problem. And the same thing happens when we see the behavioral distress as the problem. We respond to the distress, either with the pill or some other intervention. We may calm things for the moment, but that real need is still festering away, and eventually that person's going to get worse, either because we didn't address the real issue and or because the pill itself may be causing serious side effects. So this leads to a couple more secrets. I don't particularly believe our primary goal is to reduce antipsychotic drugs. Now, I got my number down close to 0 when I was last practicing full-time in the care home, as far as I could with the care system we had in place. And I would love to see antipsychotic drugs go the way of physical restraints. I call them the physical restraints of the 21st century. And I do think it's a learning curve and that we can largely eliminate the use of these medications in people with dementia. But you can't start there. And even though our federal government in the US is very wise to say, yes, we want to cut these down, their directives to say, please reduce your antipsychotics as a target of 15% by the end of the year, that's kind of problematic because you can't just take pills away if you don't know how to care differently, or else the distress will come back and you'll be right back where you started. I also don't believe our primary goal is to reduce distress. Once again, I want people living with dementia to not be distressed any more than anybody else would be in their normal life. But remember, the distress is the cough. It's not the pneumonia. So what's our real goal? Where do we start? If we're going to get these secondary outcomes, where do we start? Well, this has been the work really since my first book came out, and I mentioned it in the first book in passing, but I don't think I realized truly how big it was, and so it's generated a second whole book coming out this summer, as you'll see flyers about. I believe our primary goal is to create what I'm calling well-being. Now, what is well-being? Well, there are probably 7 billion different definitions of well-being in this world. I can't tell you what it is for you. And there are many models out there, even for people living with dementia or other people in residential care. And they're all valid models. So what I did was I grabbed onto one that I kind of liked, that I thought I could take and run with. And these 7 words mean something, and to me they're fairly easy to teach. And when I started playing around with these 7 words a few years ago and started thinking about them, it opened up another whole new world, even beyond what I had been seeing when I wrote the first book. And so I'm going to just use these as our framework and say this is where we need to go. We need to give these 7 things to people with dementia. That's our #1 goal. So what are they? Identity. Identity is having a story, a personhood that people understand. Granted, if you live with forgetfulness, you may forget some of your identity, your past, but if the people around you who support you know who you are, they can help support your identity as it evolves through your life. Connectedness is all about relationships. It's about feeling like you belong with the people around you, belong in the place where you live. It's also about connections with things besides people, connections with favorite hobbies, connections with things that are invisible, your spirituality, for instance. Security is more than an alarm on the door of your residential care home. That's part of it. That's physical safety, perhaps. But security is also knowing and trusting the people who come up to you and lay hands on you and provide care. Security is about trust and familiarity. It's about being treated with modesty, with dignity, with respect. It's about finding a balance between too much and too little throughout your day. Autonomy, choice, and control, for many people, that's huge, and it's a big problem that society tends to grab very early on, as you saw with Ed Voris' story. It's also about emotional autonomy. That's a different thing. Do we have the ability to express our emotions freely without being judged or being labeled as diseased? How many of us in this room get sad from time to time, get angry from time to time, get frustrated or scared? That's okay for us, but if it happens to a person in residential care, all of a sudden we have to medicate it. We can't allow that to happen. It's part of normal life. So do people have the autonomy to express themselves without being labeled or medicated for it. Meaning. Are the things that happen during the day in your life, whether you live in your home or in residential care, are they meaningful to you? Do they speak to your values, your spirituality, your abilities, your history? Or are they just things that are designed to keep you busy or to distract you? Do you have the ability to grow, to self-actualize as a human being? That can continue to happen. It doesn't surprise us that a person with other degenerative illnesses like multiple sclerosis, even though they might get weaker and weaker, we'd never stop thinking that they could stop learning and that they could continue to learn and grow in their lives in spite of neurologic changes. And yet it's hard to get our head around that for people with dementia. And yet we see it all the time if we're open to it. And joy, you know what joy is. So let's take wandering for an example, and I put that in quotes. This is a great way to explain how this format takes us deeper. People often come to me and say, can you give us a consultation on so-and-so? She has a problem with wandering. And once again, saying she has a problem with wandering is looking at the cough and not the pneumonia. But it's even beyond that, because let's look at that word wandering. Wandering is kind of a judgmental term to me. Wandering to me means confused, purposeless activity. I don't have a goal. I'm just wandering around. And some people might just be, not have a defined purpose. But I think many people are actually, there may be a goal behind it. There may be something they're trying to achieve by walking around. And so one thing you can say is replace the word, change it to searching. See if you can find out what a person might be searching for. Sometimes that gives you the answer. If you gave somebody a diuretic an hour ago, they might be searching for a toilet. But that's often not the case. It's often not that easy. And even when somebody says to you, I want to go home, it may not mean the house at 35 Maple Street with the green shutters and the big front porch and the rose garden. That may not be what they're searching for. Sometimes even people living in their own home say, I want to go home. So we know it's more than a structure. Often what people are searching for is right up there. Those things are not being provided very well in their living environment. And so they're looking for the place where they can feel secure, where they can feel like they belong, where they can feel like the activities that they're involved in are meaningful, where they feel like they have some choice, control, and input into their day. And what we do, because we're focused on physical safety, is we alarm the building. We may have a circular hallway, a circular courtyard. We may take the clutter off the floors, improve the lighting, put stop signs on the stairwells. We might put a pretty picture on the elevator door so it doesn't look like an elevator. Some people even do things like putting a dark stripe in front of the elevator door because they know people with dementia often see a hole in the floor when they see a dark stripe and are afraid to step over it. And boy, when you're already anxious and searching, does putting something that looks dangerous in your environment make you feel more secure? We think about us, we never think about the person with dementia. And we're actually making that behavioral distress worse instead of better when we do things like that. So that's great. We might keep the person from getting out, walking into traffic, falling down outdoors, but the wandering doesn't stop, does it? Because we haven't given them what they really need. So this takes us a lot deeper. And I don't know how it is in Australia exactly, but I know that in the US, residential care doesn't have the greatest public image. And it's not that they're bad people. I've worked in care homes for 20 years, and I think some of the finest people in the world work in residential care. But most Americans, given the choice, would not want to go live in a care home for the rest of their lives. As a matter of fact, one poll many years ago showed a third of Americans said they'd rather die than live in a care home. That's a pretty severe indictment of our system. I don't personally believe this because people don't think they'll get good medical care or good nursing care. I think by and large we do a very good job of those things. I think what frightens people about residential care is that they think that when they move in, they're going to leave those things at the door. And I think they often do, to be frank. Because we're very good at caring for the medical and nursing needs and the personal physical care needs, but we're not very good at knowing how to do this for people. And yet these are things everybody in this room, I think, would agree are important to you. And we've actually had some validation from people with dementia that these are good categories for them too. So if a person can't remember as much, if a person can't do as much as they used to, what can we do for them? This is something we can do for them. One of the things I love about these 7 domains of well-being is that they are, unlike many other quality of life scales, these are not dependent on your medical health, your functional status, or your cognitive status. A person with dementia can have all these. A person with inoperable cancer can have all these. Any one of us can have all these improved. And therefore, this is an ethical demand that we provide these for people regardless of their abilities. And we don't just write people off because they can no longer remember what they used to or do what they used to. And here's a group from Waterloo, Ontario, Canada, the Murray Alzheimer Research and Education Program, who actually use people in the community living with dementia as advisors for their research, real participatory action research. And one of the things they do was they ask people, 200 people in the US and Canada living with dementia, what are the leisure experiences you enjoy? What are the things that make life interesting and fun for you? And what is it about those experiences that make them important? And they took everybody's answers and they collated them with their panel and they put them in 7 groups. And these were the 7 characteristics of leisure experiences that made them important for people with dementia. Being me, being with, seeking freedom, finding balance, making a difference, growing and developing, having fun. This excited me when I saw this because with a little flipping of the order, I can line these up very nicely with the 7 domains I'm using. So even though you can say whether it's this framework or the Mike Nolan Census framework or the Spark of Life 5 Universal Human Needs or Kipwood's Flower of Well-Being Indicators, whatever model you use, we could all be criticized for saying that they were developed by people without dementia. But here's a group of people living with dementia who said, you know what, these things are important to us too. They don't go away just because our abilities change. So this really gives us a goal. And I personally believe that when you have those people whose needs are not easy to identify, who have that distress in spite of everything you do, this is where it's coming from. This is the thing we're not good at. We're good at checking for a bladder infection, looking to see if people have pain, if they're too hot, too cold. We can do those things. But when all that fails, this is where we have to go. And this is what people haven't figured out yet. I put these in a little hierarchy like Maslow's pyramid of needs. You might know if you study psychology. I do believe that there's a bit of ordering. I do believe that these well-being domains do flow in all directions. But if someone's well-being has been eroded, both by the illness of dementia and also by the way they're treated by the care system, then we have to bring it back to them. And there is an order, I think, that is most useful. I think it's very hard to bring well-being to people if you don't know them and if you don't have a relationship with them. So I put identity and connectedness right in the bottom of this pyramid. And once you know a person and they know you and you understand each other better, you can help them feel more secure. You can help them understand how to be secure. And once people are secure, you can negotiate that terrain of risk and decision-making with them, and they can become more autonomous in their daily life. And once they can feel safe and make more decisions, then they can do things that are meaningful and they can grow as people and they can experience joy. Now, anybody can experience joy. You can be grieving the loss of a loved one this week and you can still be at the funeral and share a happy memory and laugh about it. But I believe that if you want to have sustained joy and if you want to be able to endure those bumps that come along in life, it's good to have those other well-being domains also supported. So now in residential care, we talk about culture change. We talk about transformation of the care environment. This is really important. And for those who work in residential care, I say if you've heard about culture change and you don't want to hear about culture change, you will not change the way you care for people with dementia unless you get involved in it. It doesn't have to be an alternative. Take whatever model works for you. For those of you who don't work in residential care, you've got to do it in the home environment too. There are correlates in community-based living to the way we deinstitutionalize nursing homes. Because let's think about it. If you live in a home where your carers, both your family and your professional support system, have a stigmatized view of dementia, feel you're no longer there, that you're fading away, take away abilities before you lose them, don't involve you in decisions, don't understand your need for well-being, make you follow their schedule, not because they're bad people, but sometimes being a lone carer, you have no other way to do it. You've got to sleep when you can sleep, and so the person you're caring for has to sleep. They get a sleeping pill, even though it may not fit their schedule. When all those things happen to you, living in your own home can be just as much of an institution as any residential care home you can think of. And that's why people also suffer from loss of well-being in their own homes. Not because we're bad people, but because it takes superhuman effort to support a person with dementia when you don't have the support system that you sometimes need. So whatever environment you live in, if you try to bring new ideas in, if it's institutional, the institution will kill your ideas every single time. If you don't switch operations to embrace new ideas, you're going nowhere. And that's what culture change is. It's changing the operations where you work to embrace new ideas. How do you do that? Well, in residential care, well, before we get to that, let me tell you about this other big secret. This is my challenging one. This is the one that people don't quite get. I'm being provocative on purpose. Why would the guy who wrote a book called Dementia Beyond Drugs say non-pharmacological interventions don't work? Well, the reason is because I tried them for years when I didn't like the drugs and they didn't work. And I had to wrestle with that and say, okay, Al, if you think the drugs are so bad, how come your other ideas aren't working? What's the problem here? Well, it's not the idea of getting away from pills. That's a good idea. The problem is that we're still in that biomedical mindset when we go about how we apply these interventions. They are really interventions. Remember the old 80s intervention? It was a group of friends or family that would lure somebody to their home or apartment under false pretenses, and then they would jump on them and tell them about a behavior of his that they deemed harmful, and they tried to straighten them out. You don't hear about them much anymore. I guess they didn't work very well, did they? But it occurred to me that a lot of our non-pharmacologic interventions are very similar. They're a group of caring people who are approaching somebody whose behavior they think is not in line with what we think it should be. And through a lot of things, little bits of diversion, distraction, or even those little white lies, we're trying to bring a person back in line with what we think they should do, whether it's what they want or not. And we do it from that biomedical mindset. So it's often reactive, not proactive. We just, when someone gets agitated, we respond this way. And that may calm them, but what's going to happen tomorrow? They're going to get agitated again because we didn't seek to understand where that came from. It tends to be treated like doses of pills. You know, full washcloths once a day. Pet a cat 3 times a day before meals, as if we're taking a pill. It's superimposed on the care environment, but it doesn't change that person's life to have these discrete interventions. They're often from our own laundry list. Let's try this. How about folding laundry? How about a hand massage? How about, sitting in front of television, listening to music? It doesn't seek to understand the person and what their needs are, their well-being needs. And the story I've shared that I think is a perfect example of this is a gentleman I heard about in the state of Iowa when I was speaking, a rural part of the United States. And he was trying to go out the back door of his care home every day, looking out the window and heading for the door. And everybody kept redirecting him because they didn't want him going outside alone, and he would get more persistent the more they would redirect him. And finally, the home manager said, listen, there's a fence out there. You can watch him. He's not going to get away from you. Why don't you let him go and see what he's trying to do? So next time he went for the door, they let him go. They stood in the doorway and watched him. He went to the back fence, and there was a herd of cattle out back. And he stood there and he watched the cows for about 15 minutes, turned around, came inside, sat down, and was calm. Well, they didn't know him very well. He was fairly new to them. And when they talked to the family, it turned out he had been a dairy farmer. And every morning he went out and checked the cows. Now, our response when we saw that behavior would be, let's try a hand massage. Let's try having him fold laundry. He didn't need that stuff. He needed to check the cows. And so our algorithms for non-pharmacologic interventions are never going to help this guy because we don't know him. And that's why our research in non-pharmacologic interventions is so poor. People say, let's try lemon balm aromatherapy. It's known to be very calming. So let's do a study of it. So we come into the nursing home, we pick people, we randomize half of them, we give them this intervention we chose at a time we choose for a whole list of different types of behaviors that may be very individualized, and then we're shocked when everybody doesn't get better. And sure, those interventions do as well as antipsychotics do, but people are always disappointed and they say, we really thought this would help more people. Well, we're going about it the wrong way. It works for some people, but if we don't understand the person, we're never going to get there. And so I got to tell my favorite Richard Taylor story, and I'm going to wrap things up soon so we can have some discussion. Richard Taylor, when he speaks at residential care homes, likes to talk to some of the people who live there. And he went to visit some folks in a dementia-specific living area who might be described as having a moderate degree of dementia. And these 2 ladies were sitting at a table, and they were folding children's clothes and putting them in a basket. And he introduced himself, talked to them for a while, made some small talk, and then he said, tell me about these clothes. Do these belong to children of staff members? Is there a daycare on site? And one of the women looked at him and she said, no, there are no kids here. And he said, are these maybe donations for the poor? And she looked at her friend and she said, should we tell him? And her friend said, yeah, go ahead. And she said, no, there are no children here. They bring us a pile of clothes, and we fold them, put them in the basket, and then they take them away somewhere and they mess them up and bring them back, and we fold them again. The other way you may interpret that is I may have dementia, but I'm not stupid, okay? And, Richard must have had a shocked look on his face because the other woman jumped in. She said, yeah, but, it's better than a stick in the eye. And he said, Can't we do a little better than that in residential care? Can't we do something that's just not just better than a stick in the eye? So once again, folding napkins and setting a table for a communal meal, that has some meaning. It has some end result. But busy work, everybody knows when busy work is busy work. There was no meaning in that activity. There was no connectedness. And so once again, we have to be careful about how we occupy people. So I'm going to just jump through and give you one clue about communication. For those of you who support people and have trouble understanding what they're saying, this is something that came to me through a couple of comments. One of them is the one that Richard Taylor made about calling his son or daughter mom or dad by mistake. And another comes from a quote that Christine Bryden wrote in her book, Dancing with Dementia. And it's actually the quote that I used to close my first book. And she says, I believe people with dementia are making an important journey from cognition into emotion and finally into spirit, meaning at the very end of their lives. And that's all she said, but when I thought about that, and I've wrestled with that over the years, there's something I gleaned from that I hadn't thought of before. And that is that many people who lose the weight of memories and facts at their ready disposal start to process the world much more through the level of emotions, feelings, and symbolic thinking. The rest of us are living in the world of logic, facts, memories. And so when a person says something, we get stuck on the words and the logic, and we try to answer that, and we miss completely what the person's saying. So if someone says, I need to pick up my kids from school, we get stuck on those words, and we get stuck in that dichotomy. Do we lie and say, oh, don't worry, your husband went to get the kids and they're fine, and then have that blow up in our face later when it doesn't come to pass? Or do we tell the bald truth? Your kids are 60 years old, you live in a nursing home, you don't have to pick them up, and that never works either, does it? And that's that bipolar thinking that we don't do either one. We understand that they're not saying necessarily that they believe their kids are 12 years old and need to come home from school. What they're saying is, what does that say about well-being? I'm concerned about my kids. I'm concerned about my family. Where are they? Are they safe? That's one thing they might be saying. Or they might be saying, my current living environment doesn't provide me with any meaning or any caring role anymore. And I have to go to a place where I had a caring role. And that's what I'm expressing to you. And so instead of going to either lying or telling the truth, we need to validate what the person's feeling. And then we need to explore what it is that's missing from the standpoint of well-being, and then find ways to supply that for them over time. I heard about a woman in the UK who kept asking for her mother, and the staff went back and forth. First they'd say her mother wasn't there, but she'd be there tomorrow. That didn't work. Then they'd try to tell her gently her mother was dead. That didn't work. Finally, one of the staff members was with her, and she said, where's my mother? And she stopped, and she just sat with her, and she said, boy, I'm sorry you miss your mother. It's really hard not having her here, isn't it? Spent some time validating her feeling of loss. And then she said to her, what would your mother do if she were here right now? And without hesitating, the woman said, she would love me. And what that told her was that this was something she was not getting from her staff, affectionate care. And that gave them a clue about what she was really looking for. So I was telling these stories up in Alaska, Juneau Pioneers Home. And after the talk and the dinner and the social hour, a woman came up to me whose mother had moved in, and she said, you really helped me solve a problem I've been having with my mother. She just moved in here a few weeks ago. And every night when I come to see her after work and it's time to go home and I say, I'm going, Mother, good night, she gets a little concerned and she starts saying, where are you going to sleep? And my answer every night has been, Mom, I'm going home, of course. And as soon as I say that, it triggers her. I say home. She starts missing her home. She wants to be with her husband. She wants to leave. And it becomes tears and a big production. And I got to the point where I was about to come in less often because I couldn't deal with this every night. And she said, I thought about this message, and I said, what is she really saying? I've been answering, where are you going to sleep? Instead, what I thought is, what she's saying is, I'm still her daughter. She still cares about me. She wants to know I'm safe and happy. So tonight, after the meeting and the dinner, I took her to her room, and when she asked me where I'm going to sleep, I said, Mom, I've got the best place to sleep tonight. I've got this big, beautiful bed, and I've got a wonderful book I'm reading, and I'm going to curl up with a cup of tea and have a great night. And her mother smiled and said goodnight, and she walked out the door. So once again, understanding where people are coming from instead of trying to drag them to our level of thinking can give you new insights that you never had before. I am going to probably stop around there because we really need to get there. I'm going to leave you with my friend Nader's quote, when we care for an elder, we care for that part of ourselves that will someday grow old. And I'm going to just see what types of questions, comments you have. You know, my system is not perfect. All I can tell you is it's a hell of a lot better than what I used to do. And we continue to work on it and refine it. And so I'm happy to entertain any comments or questions you might have. Thanks very much, everybody. I would say that the person is still 100% there, that they do have a cognitive disability or changing cognitive ability, and that has made it hard for them to connect with the world in the way they used to, but that those well-being needs are still there, and that it is up to us really to understand how to continue to enable that person. That really is, you know, when I talk about those two different ways of looking at dementia, one of the ways I summarize it is by saying if you see someone who's distressed, if you have a biomedical mindset, you might say he's confused because he has dementia. If you have an experiential mindset, you might say, I'm confused because I don't understand what he's trying to communicate to me. And I think if you start there, you can start to get insights that maybe people didn't have before. So I hope that helps. And once again, the question, just for the camera, is wearing several hats, educating others. What's one thing we could do to start with to help start reframing dementia for people? I had a comment. I taught my class in Denmark recently. I've taught it a couple times there, but the first time I got a comment that never happened before. It was sort of a compliment, and no one had ever said that before, and I never thought of it that way, but I really appreciated it. Because I was in Denmark, and even though a lot of Danish people speak English better than a lot of Americans do, I just wanted to make sure that everything that I was talking about was, number one, translating through the language, and number two, translating through culture and systems of care. And so at the beginning of the second day, I just checked in with the class, and I said, how are you doing with all this information? Can you give me some feedback about how this is working for you? And there were a couple of comments, and a nurse raised her hand, a nurse who had been in nursing in elder care for a long time. And she said, this is the first time in my career that I've seen people with dementia as normal people. And I thought, you know, that's kind of okay. That's really what I'm trying to do, is to remind us that we have a normal person who just happens to limp because they have arthritis in their hip. Or this is a normal person who just happens to wear an insulin pump. And here's a normal person who tends to forget and have some changes in their cognitive ability. That's the ideal, I think. Okay. Yeah. Okay, good. So the question is, having a loved one who had a lot of abilities, was very crafty with his hands, could make something out of nothing, is repeating some of these things, and it's being labeled an agitated behavior. And how can you respond to people that see the disease and don't really understand the person? Well, the first thing is we always start all of our workshops by making sure people are well known. So making sure that those carers understand who the person is, more than just his medical diagnoses or his medications. That's important, but you have to know his history too. You have to know his skills. So that's one thing. Something else you said that's very important, you kind of change the language to make it more specific, and that is you said. Now I got to remember how you phrased it because it's really important. I'll come back to it. Okay. So the other thing is he is repeating some aspects of his past life, perhaps, or it's being interpreted a different way. I know what it was. The other thing you said was that it's real to him. One thing you need to know about a person who expresses some emotion is that whatever a person sees or feels is real. And it may not match our reality, what my friend Nader calls our consensus reality, but that is their reality, and telling them that what they feel is not legitimate never makes people feel better. So just get that idea when someone's acutely distressed out of your head about reorienting people. You can see why it doesn't work. Have you ever, in a relationship, told somebody they had no right to feel the way they do? How'd that work out for you? It's not just dementia we're talking about, okay? So that's the other point. So I think that what we need to know is we need to help people understand the evolving self and the need for occupation, the need for meaningful occupation. This is a gentleman who's looking for something to do that ties into those things that gave him meaning in his past life. It's meaning, it's connectedness, it's a little bit of autonomy, it's a lot of identity. And so we need to find out how his self is evolving and tap into not just generic programmed activities, but ways to engage him in ways where he can continue to tap into those strengths and those abilities he's got. And one of the words I like to get rid of in residential care is the word feel, in the sense of let's give people things to do to help them feel useful. I want you to give people things to do to help them be useful, because feeling useful involves a certain amount of deception or subterfuge. What can he do that taps into his abilities that can contribute to the life of the home in a way that's visible and meaningful for him? It may not be easily obvious when people have trouble attending to certain activities. It might just be asking him to tell stories about the work he did, showing pictures of the kinds of craft and trade he used to do, talking about it, bringing in people who apply that trade. We had a meteorologist come in once and talk to a retired meteorologist about how they forecast the weather and talk to the rest of the group, and the two of them spoke together. Find ways you can partner with that person to enable those things, but also recognize that the self does evolve. There are some things that we can bring from our past lives, and there are other things we have to let go of because our abilities or our priorities and desires change. And sometimes I find that carers and family members get stuck on something that he always used to like to do. But once again, that may not be who that person is today. So I have a quote in my new book. I don't think I can say it as beautifully as Sam Fazio did. But he says basically that the past must be allowed to influence the present, but not to dictate it. The present also must be allowed to influence the present. And both the past and the future must be allowed to influence, or past and present must be allowed to influence the future, and the future must be able to influence itself. So it is an evolving process, just like all of us evolves, our desires, our priorities, our abilities. And that's a tough balance, but you have to understand who the person was, but not get so tied into it that you only dwell on the past, only reminisce. You have to give people a bridge to their current life. So yeah, connecting them to their prior home is great, but what is it in their new home that can make them also feel like this is my home now? What are the things they used to do that we can bring to bridge us to the new living environment so people can continue to have meaningful occupation where they live now? Okay, the question was, the questioner's husband, who's living with dementia, has stopped driving and is now the passenger. And will frequently make comments about the safety of the driving, about potential hazards, people in the driveway, cars coming, those types of things. It's frustrating. Makes you want to remind them that I am a good driver. I do know what I'm doing. You can relax. First of all, let's go beyond the world of dementia. Anybody ever experienced this with significant others? So once again, dementia is a wrinkle, but it's not the only experience, okay? Let me go back to Ed Vorse for a minute and tell you what Ed's story tells us. And once again, this is not suggesting anything particular about your personal experience, but the societal view of dementia tends to be that as soon as you lose one decision, we're quick to take everything away. And often people become frustrated because their loved ones won't give up the car keys. But what we have to understand is it may not be that that person thinks they're the best driver. It may be that that person sees that slippery slope. They know that as soon as they turn over one decision, we may be quick to take everything away. And one of the things I talk about in my courses, and particularly in the new book upcoming, is that there are many, many levels of ability, capacity, choice, and control. You may not be able to make every decision, but there's almost always some level of choice and control you can make. So if there's anything about this gentleman's life where he feels like he's abdicated control, once again, every time a concern is brought to me, I now look at it through these 7 domains. So I'm looking at autonomy and security. Here's a person who feels maybe a little bit less like the nurturing husband, a little bit less like a man because this important societal familial role has been taken from him. So he has to be of help. He has to help you. He's doing it because he has to have that caring role. And also the feeling of security. He may be more anxious because we all know that when you're not the one behind the wheel, it's a little bit more frightening no matter how good the other driver is. And once again, that goes beyond dementia. That's why I think so many people are more frightened of flying in planes than they are driving in cars, even though cars are way more dangerous. Because once again, there's no control when you're in the seat of the plane, even though only 1 out of 1 million may ever have a serious problem. And so I think, first of all, is their appreciation that this is something the person needs. And if you understand that, yeah, it's frustrating, but maybe you can get beyond, okay, it's not that he's saying I'm a bad driver. He needs to continue to be part of the driving process. He no longer controls the keys or the steering wheel. How can I help him be part of this? And if there are other things you can do to bring autonomy into that driving experience, help him choose the route, ask him for input. What do you think is the best way to go today? Should we go left up here, or should we take the view through the park? Once again, I don't know his abilities, but the more you can give people little bits of autonomy, the less they're going to feel the need to grab it in other areas. And so just a few thoughts about that. I have a story written by a wonderful book written by a woman about her husband living with Alzheimer's. And when they would go out walking, there was a stage in his life where he would become very frightened. He'd see a child and be worried that that child might be lost, or he'd, take his wife's hand if there was a crack in the sidewalk. He has to have that caring, nurturing role. Know a woman whose husband has Alzheimer's who, when they go out to dinner, one of the things she'll do is if they come to a stairway, she'll say to him, "Will you take my arm so I don't fall?" Now, what she's doing is she's taking his arm, but she is realizing that he needs that caregiving role too. If you take all that away, you take away meaning, you take away the ability to care for others. So we always want to create something. And I'll finish up with a great quote from Christine Bryden, if you give me 2 more minutes. This is another thing I can leave with people, both professional carers and family carers. And I know you use the word carers. I think that's a lot better than caregiver. But the word I use, which I got from Christine, is care partners. And a lot of people use it now, but she's the first person I ever heard it. She wrote her definition 10 years into her life with dementia. It's still the best definition I've ever heard. And so I'm going to give you as close to word for word as I recall Christine Bryden's definition. And this is what Christine says, speaking to her caregivers. Christine says, adopting a sole identity as our caregiver highlights our illness and strips both of us of other identities. We have become caregiver and sufferer in a relationship of codependence. In this relationship, you may soon feel overwhelmed by the multitude of tasks, of planning and preparing for two, of organizing for two, of covering our deficits or grieving our losses rather than looking for what remains. You can soon become sad, depressed, and in despair. At the same time, if we adopt a sole identity as a sufferer of our illness, we learn helplessness. We lose more function and have an excess disability. This only adds to your burdens as a caregiver and exacerbates the problems for both of us. We need to move beyond labeling ourselves as caregiver and sufferer towards a care partnership in which we accept and adapt and collaborate on this journey of dementia. In the care partnership, the person with dementia is at the center, not alone as merely an object or a recipient of care. Instead, we become an active partner in the circle of care. And so the idea of care partnerships, no matter what your role is a very freeing one. It takes some of the burden off, and you realize that that person continues to be actively involved in every daily activity. And it creates a whole rich new experience that actually liberates that person to continue to be involved meaningfully and engage with life. So I'll leave you with that. We'll talk some more informally, but thanks again for all your great questions.